"Security, remove this popper," my daughter-in-law said across the table, as if she were asking someone to clear away a used plate. For a moment, no one moved. The restaurant was one of those upscale places where the lighting was soft and the glasses were so thin they almost rang when you touched them. The kind of place where people lowered their voices and pretended their lives were perfectly arranged. I remember the smell of rosemary chicken drifting from the kitchen, the quiet clink of silverware, and the way every conversation at the nearby tables seemed to fade all at once. My name is Helen Whitmore. I was 68 years old that night, and I had just learned exactly what my place was in my own family. My son Ethan sat 2 seats to my right. He stared down at his napkin like it had suddenly become fascinating. Across from me, my daughter-in-law Vanessa rested one manicured hand on the table and watched the security guard approach as calmly as if she'd been expecting him all along. A week earlier, Ethan had invited me to what he called a family dinner. He said he wanted to reconnect, to bring everyone together after a long year of distance and busy schedules. I spent an hour choosing a dress that evening, a navy one I'd worn to church on Easter, and wrapped Ethan's favorite lemon loaf in foil to bring along, even though I knew restaurants didn't usually allow outside food. Old habits are hard to break. When you've been a mother for 40 years, you don't stop showing up with something homemade, just because the tablecloths are white linen and the wine list is printed on heavy paper. When I arrived at the restaurant, Vanessa was already there, sitting perfectly straight in a cream-colored jacket that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. She gave me that tight smile she always used, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Helen," she said, as if my name were a word she'd practiced but never liked saying. Ethan hugged me quickly, the way people hug relatives at airports when they're already thinking about the next thing. For the first few minutes, the dinner looked normal. Water glasses filled. Bread baskets arrived. Vanessa talked about a charity gala she'd attended the previous weekend, and Ethan nodded along while scrolling through something on his phone. I tried to ask about work, about the house they were renovating, about my granddaughter Mia's college plans. Vanessa answered for everyone. Then the waiter set down the appetizers, and Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair. She looked at me from head to toe in a way that made the room feel colder. It wasn't loud when she said it. That's what made it worse. "Security, remove this popper." The guard hesitated. He glanced at Ethan first. My son didn't look up. The silence around our table spread like a ripple in water. I could feel people nearby pretending not to watch. I adjusted the strap of my purse, stood up slowly, and gave the guard a polite smile. "It's all right," I said. "I was just leaving." Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She simply lifted her glass and took a sip of wine while I walked toward the exit of the restaurant I had been invited to. The night air outside was cool, maybe 60 degrees, with the smell of rain on the pavement. I stood there for a moment under the streetlight, listening to the muffled music from inside. The strange thing was, I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I thought about the word she had used. Pauper. As if she had already decided who I was. As if the last 40 years of my life could be reduced to a single insult spoken between courses at a dinner table. I got into my car, set my purse on the passenger seat, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the restaurant windows glowed warm and golden. Inside, my family was probably finishing their meal. I drove home quietly that night, thinking about the way Vanessa had said the word, and about the way Ethan had said nothing at all. And somewhere between the restaurant and my driveway, a quiet realization settled in my mind. Vanessa believed she had humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered. What she didn't realize was that she had also done something else. She had done it in public. And sometimes, when people choose the stage for you, all you have to do is wait a little while before you step back into the spotlight. I slept very little that night. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound seem louder than it should be. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. The old clock above the hallway ticked with patient, steady seconds. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea around midnight and sat at the small table near the window, the same table where my husband Daniel and I had shared thousands of late-night conversations over the years. Outside, the streetlights cast pale circles on the sidewalk, and a light breeze moved the branches of the maple tree in the front yard. I wrapped my hands around the mug and thought about the restaurant again, not with anger, but with a strange clarity that only arrives after humiliation has settled into memory. The words she used still echoed in my mind, but it no longer stung the way it had earlier that evening. Instead, it felt like a piece of evidence, something I could examine from every angle. Pauper. It was a curious choice. Vanessa had always been careful with her language, careful with her image. She liked expensive rooms and polite company and carefully curated photographs on social media. Yet that night, she had allowed the word to slip out in front of strangers, waiters, and a security guard who had probably seen every kind of family drama a restaurant could offer. That meant something. People like Vanessa rarely make mistakes in public unless they believe they are completely safe. Around 2 in the morning, I stood up, rinsed the empty mug, and walked slowly through the house. The hallway photographs caught my attention as they often did. Ethan at age 8 holding a baseball glove almost as large as his arm. Ethan at 16 in his high school graduation robe. Ethan and Vanessa on their wedding day standing under a white arch with roses. I paused there longer than I expected. I remembered the day clearly. The music, the laughter, the way Vanessa had hugged me and said she was grateful to be joining our family. It is remarkable how memories change shape once you begin to look at them differently. I went to bed eventually, but sleep never really came. Instead, my mind drifted through small moments from the past year. Vanessa insisting that holiday dinners be hosted at her house instead of mine. Vanessa suggesting that Ethan handle certain financial matters for the family because, in her words, older people deserved less stress. Vanessa gently laughing. One afternoon, when I mentioned fixing a leak in my kitchen sink myself, she had tilted her head and said, with a smile that looked friendly on the surface, that sometimes it was better for people my age to accept help rather than pretend they could manage everything. At the time, I thought she was being thoughtful. Now I realized something else had been happening. By 7 in the morning, sunlight was spilling through the curtains in thin golden lines across the floor. I brewed coffee and opened the small notebook I kept beside the kitchen phone. Daniel used to joke that I treated that notebook like a detective file because I wrote down everything important in careful handwriting. Appointment reminders, addresses, insurance numbers, and the occasional note about conversations that seemed worth remembering. I turned several pages slowly until I reached a note from 3 months earlier. It was a reminder Vanessa had given Ethan about reviewing something she called the family asset structure. I had not thought much about it then. Families discuss money from time to time. But now the words seemed heavier on the page. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long moment watching steam rise from my coffee mug. The humiliation at the restaurant had been unpleasant, but humiliation alone was rarely the whole story. People do not attempt to push someone out of the room unless they are preparing to take the seat that person once occupied. By mid-morning, the phone rang. The name on the screen surprised me more than I expected. Charles Benton, my late husband's attorney. I had not spoken to him in almost a year. When I answered, his voice sounded polite but slightly cautious, as if he were choosing his words very carefully. He said there were a few documents he wanted to review with me regarding matters Daniel had organized before he passed away. He asked if I might be available later that afternoon. I looked down at the notebook on the table, then at the quiet kitchen around me. Something about the timing felt too precise to be coincidence. I told him that I would be there. When I ended the call, I finished my coffee slowly and walked toward the front door to collect the morning mail. The day was bright and calm, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that rarely appears in dramatic stories. Yet as I stood on the porch with the envelope in my hand, one clear thought settled firmly in my mind. Whatever had begun at that dinner table the night before had not ended when I walked out of the restaurant. In many ways, it had only just begun. I arrived at Charles Benton's office a little before 2 in the afternoon. His building sat on a quiet street downtown, the kind lined with brick facades and narrow trees planted evenly along the sidewalk. The brass directory near the entrance still listed his firm the same way it had for decades, and seeing it there stirred a familiar memory of Daniel walking beside me through those doors years earlier. Back then, the meetings had been routine. Estate planning, insurance, the responsible conversations people have when they believe they still have many years ahead of them. Charles greeted me in the reception area with the same careful politeness he had always shown. He was older now, his hair almost entirely silver, but his voice still carried that steady tone that made people trust him. He guided me into his office and closed the door softly behind us. For a moment, he simply looked at me as though he were deciding where to begin. The office itself smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Shelves filled with legal volumes lined the walls, and sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the street. Charles sat down behind his desk and folded his hands together. He said he had received several inquiries recently regarding documents connected to Daniel's estate, specifically the Whitmore family trust Daniel established about 5 years before his passing. The trust was something Daniel had explained to me in simple terms at the time. It was designed to protect certain assets for future generations while ensuring I would remain financially independent and comfortable. Hearing Charles mention it again made me sit a little straighter in the chair. He continued carefully, explaining that someone had contacted his office twice during the past month asking about procedures for transferring certain supervisory privileges connected to the trust. That alone was not unusual. Families often review estate structures as circumstances change. What concerned him was the tone of the inquiries and the specific details being requested. The person who called had asked whether the primary beneficiary could voluntarily step aside if there were concerns about age, judgment, or financial management. Charles paused then and looked directly at me. His eyes were calm but attentive, as if he were watching for the smallest reaction. I felt a quiet heaviness settle in my chest as I listened. I asked him who had made those calls. Charles hesitated only briefly before answering. The requests had come through an assistant representing Ethan and Vanessa Whitmore. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, a bus rolled slowly past the intersection, and a pedestrian waited at the crosswalk holding a paper coffee cup. Ordinary life continued moving along the street below while a very different understanding was forming in my mind. Charles opened a folder and slid a few printed pages toward me across the desk. They were notes taken by his receptionist during the phone conversations. Certain sentences were underlined. Questions about medical evaluations. Questions about financial oversight. Questions about what legal options might exist if a beneficiary was believed to be unable to responsibly manage significant assets. The language was polite, professional even, but the intention behind the questions was unmistakable. Someone was preparing a narrative in which I would appear incapable of handling my own affairs. I read the notes slowly, my finger resting against the edge of the page. Vanessa had not chosen that word at the restaurant randomly. Pauper. A person without money, without standing, without authority. If she could convince others that I was dependent or incompetent, then the path to controlling Daniel's trust would become much easier. I looked up from the papers and met Charles's eyes again. He spoke gently, explaining that the trust contained several protective clauses Daniel had insisted upon. Those clauses made it extremely difficult for anyone to alter its structure without my direct consent. However, he said, the situation suggested that someone might attempt to pressure or embarrass me into surrendering those rights voluntarily. I thought again of the dinner table, the quiet restaurant, and Vanessa calmly instructing security to remove me like an inconvenience. The scene no longer looked like a moment of cruelty. It looked like the opening move in a much larger plan. Charles asked if everything at home had been peaceful lately. I considered the question carefully before answering. Peaceful was not the word I would have chosen anymore. When I left the office that afternoon, the sky had turned a bright, clear blue, and the sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby buildings. I walked slowly to my car holding the folder Charles had given me. For years I believed Vanessa merely disliked me. Now it was becoming clear that she had something else entirely in mind. And for the first time since that dinner, I understood exactly why she needed the world to believe I was nothing more than a pauper. I drove home from Charles Benton's office with the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, the papers inside sliding softly every time the car turned a corner. The afternoon traffic moved slowly through downtown, and for once I did not mind the delay. It gave me time to think. When people believe they are clever, they often reveal more than they intend. Vanessa had spent years presenting herself as graceful, polished, and careful with every word she spoke. Yet the questions her assistant had asked Charles's office were not graceful at all. They were strategic. They were the kind of questions people ask when they are preparing to reshape someone else's story. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun was stretching long shadows across the lawn. The maple tree near the front porch rustled gently in the breeze, the same tree Daniel planted 20 years ago when Ethan was still in college. I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, looking at the house the two of us had built together piece by piece. Daniel used to say that a home should be quiet enough for thinking and strong enough to protect the people inside it. I carried the folder into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the table. The house was still and familiar, the smell of fresh coffee lingering faintly from the morning. I opened the folder again and read through the notes one more time. The questions about financial oversight. The hints about medical evaluations. The polite language that quietly suggested an older woman might not be capable of managing her own affairs anymore. None of it accused me directly. That was the clever part. Instead, it planted the idea that perhaps someone should step in for my own good. I closed the folder slowly and leaned back in the chair. The dinner at the restaurant suddenly made perfect sense. Vanessa had not simply wanted to embarrass me. She had wanted witnesses. If enough people saw her treat me like someone insignificant, someone dependent, then the story she planned to tell later would sound believable. That evening the phone rang just after 6 o'clock. The caller identification displayed Ethan's name. I let it ring once more before answering. His voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced what he intended to say. He asked if I had made it home safely after leaving the restaurant the night before. I told him that I had. There was a pause on the line that stretched several seconds longer than it should have. Then he said that Vanessa might have spoken too sharply and that the evening had simply gotten out of hand. I listened quietly while he spoke. He did not apologize directly. Instead, he explained that Vanessa had been under a lot of stress lately and that sometimes people said things they did not mean. I thought about the folder on my kitchen table and the careful questions her assistant had asked Charles's office weeks before that dinner ever happened. Stress did not produce plans like that. Planning did. I told Ethan that I appreciated his concern and that I hoped he and Vanessa had enjoyed the rest of their meal. He sounded relieved by my calm tone. Perhaps he believed the situation had already faded into an uncomfortable memory. Before ending the call, he mentioned that Vanessa hoped we could all meet again soon to talk about some family matters, including future arrangements and responsibilities. The phrase hung in the air after he said it. Future arrangements. Responsibilities. It was exactly the kind of language Charles had described in the notes earlier that afternoon. I told Ethan that I would be happy to talk whenever they felt it was convenient. When the call ended, the house returned to its quiet stillness. Outside, the sky was turning the soft gray color that comes just before sunset. I walked to the front window and watched the street for a moment, my reflection faint in the glass. Vanessa believed she had already begun shaping the story everyone else would hear about me. An older woman losing control. A mother who needed help managing things she no longer understood. But stories, like legal documents, depend heavily on who is telling them. And as I stood there, in the fading light, I realized something that Vanessa had clearly overlooked. Daniel Whitmore had spent his entire life preparing for the possibility that someone might try exactly what she was attempting now. And he had never been the kind of man who left important things unprotected. The evening after Ethan called, I made a simple dinner for myself and sat at the kitchen table where the folder from Charles Benton still rested. I did not rush through the pages anymore. Instead, I read each line slowly, as if I were studying a map before beginning a long journey. The more I looked at the notes, the more clearly the pattern appeared. Vanessa had been asking careful questions for weeks, possibly months. Questions about medical oversight, questions about financial supervision, questions about how a family might legally intervene if an older beneficiary seemed unable to manage complex decisions. None of the questions mentioned my name directly, but the intention was obvious. I finished dinner, washed the dishes, and placed the folder neatly back on the table. The house felt calm in the way it always had after Daniel passed away, a calm that sometimes felt peaceful and sometimes felt like a quiet reminder that the person who once shared every decision with me was no longer there. Around 8:30 the doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone, so for a moment I simply stood in the hallway listening to the sound echo through the house. When I opened the door, I found my granddaughter Mia standing on the porch with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she looked slightly out of breath, as if she had walked faster than usual to reach the house. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile faded quickly into something more serious. Mia had always been the thoughtful one in our family, observant in a quiet way that reminded me of Daniel. She stepped inside and set her backpack near the door. I asked if everything was all right. She nodded at first, then hesitated before answering that she had wanted to see me after hearing about the dinner the night before. News travels quickly inside families, even when no one intends it to. I told her she did not need to worry, and that sometimes adults simply had disagreements. Mia looked down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. She said that the dinner might not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. Her voice was careful but determined. According to Mia, Vanessa had been talking about that evening for several days before it happened. She had told Ethan that it was time to address certain issues in front of the right people so that everyone would understand how things were going to change in the family going forward. Mia had overheard part of the conversation while she was studying in the living room. At the time, she thought Vanessa was referring to something related to work or social events. Now she believed the dinner had been arranged for a different purpose entirely. I felt the same quiet clarity I experienced earlier that afternoon in Charles's office settle into place once again. The pieces of the story were beginning to connect. Vanessa had wanted witnesses, just as I suspected. If she could show others that I was unwelcome or somehow dependent, then the narrative she planned to present later would sound more convincing. Mia sat at the kitchen table and listened while I explained only a small part of what Charles had told me about the trust and the recent inquiries made by Vanessa's assistant. I did not want to burden her with every detail, but she was old enough to understand that something important was happening. She nodded slowly as I spoke, her expression thoughtful in the same quiet way her grandfather used to have when he was considering a complicated problem. After a few minutes, she looked at me and said something that made me smile despite everything that had happened during the past 2 days. She said that people who try to control the story usually forget that other people are watching the whole time. The comment was simple but wise. I walked Mia to the door a little later that evening and watched her head down the sidewalk toward her parents' house 3 blocks away. The streetlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled over the neighborhood. When I returned to the kitchen, I looked again at the folder on the table and then at the quiet house around me. Vanessa believed she was slowly guiding the family toward a future she had designed. What she did not realize yet was that the same future would require my signature before anything could truly change. And after everything I had learned during the past 24 hours, I was beginning to understand exactly how valuable that signature might become. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The house was still wrapped in that quiet gray light that comes just before sunrise, when the neighborhood is calm and the world has not quite decided what kind of day it will be. I brewed a pot of coffee and carried my cup to the small table near the window. The folder from Charles Benton remained where I had left it the night before. For a few minutes, I simply watched the steam rise from my coffee and listened to the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. When people believe they are winning, they often grow impatient. That impatience can be useful if you know how to wait. Around 9 in the morning, the phone rang again. This time the caller identification displayed Vanessa's name. I answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice sounded smooth and friendly, almost cheerful, as if the uncomfortable moment at the restaurant had never happened. She said she had been thinking about the family lately, and that perhaps it was time for everyone to sit down together and talk openly about the future. She mentioned practical matters such as responsibilities, planning, and making sure things were organized properly for the next generation. The way she spoke reminded me of someone describing a renovation project rather than a family conversation. I thanked her for reaching out and told her I agreed that clarity was always helpful. I could almost hear the quiet satisfaction in her voice when she realized I was not resisting the idea. She suggested meeting in a week, somewhere comfortable where everyone could talk calmly. I said that sounded reasonable. When the call ended, I set the phone down and took another slow sip of coffee. Vanessa believed she was guiding events toward a conversation where I would eventually step aside and allow Ethan and her to take control of decisions Daniel had carefully arranged years ago. What she did not understand was that Daniel had never built anything fragile. After breakfast, I drove back downtown to Charles Benton's office for a brief meeting we had scheduled earlier that morning. Charles listened carefully while I described the phone call and Vanessa's suggestion of a family discussion. He nodded once or twice, but did not interrupt. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and opened another drawer of his desk. Inside were several documents Daniel had signed during the final year before his passing. Charles explained that Daniel had anticipated the possibility that someone might one day attempt to pressure me into altering the trust. Because of that concern, he had included several provisions that would activate if any beneficiary attempted to undermine or manipulate the primary trustee. Those provisions did not rely on arguments or opinions. They relied on evidence. Clear, documented actions that could not easily be explained away. I listened quietly while Charles outlined how those provisions worked. The more he spoke, the more I realized that Daniel had not only protected our assets, he had protected the truth of how those assets were meant to be handled. When I left the office that afternoon, the sky was bright and clear again. I walked slowly toward my car, thinking about the meeting Vanessa wanted to arrange in 1 week. She believed that meeting would be the moment everything shifted in her favor. She believed she would be the one guiding the conversation, setting the tone, and presenting the future she had already imagined. As I drove home through the afternoon traffic, I allowed myself a small smile. Sometimes the most powerful position in a conversation is not the person who speaks first. It is the person who already understands how the conversation will end. When I reached my driveway, I parked the car and sat for a moment looking at the house Daniel and I had built together. The maple tree in the yard moved gently in the breeze, its leaves whispering softly against one another. 1 week. Vanessa thought she was preparing a meeting to settle the future of the Whitmore family. In reality, she had just scheduled the moment when the story she had been quietly building would finally be tested against the truth Daniel had left behind. The days leading up to the meeting passed quietly, almost peacefully, which was exactly what Vanessa expected. I followed my normal routines with deliberate calm. I watered the plants on the porch each morning, drove to the grocery store on Wednesday, and spent Thursday afternoon organizing old photographs in the living room. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside the small notebook on my kitchen table, the same one Daniel used to joke about, I began writing down small details. The date of the dinner, the exact words Vanessa had used at the restaurant, the time Ethan called the following evening, the conversation Vanessa and I had about arranging a family meeting. None of it was dramatic, yet every detail mattered. By Friday afternoon, Ethan called again. His tone sounded lighter than before, almost optimistic. He said Vanessa had reserved a private room at a quiet restaurant downtown for the following Wednesday evening. He described it as a relaxed place where we could speak comfortably without distractions. I thanked him for letting me know and told him that Wednesday evening would work perfectly for me. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the time and location in my notebook. 6:30 in the evening. Private dining room. Whitmore family discussion. I closed the notebook and allowed myself a moment to consider what Vanessa must be imagining. In her version of the story, the meeting would begin politely. She would speak carefully about responsibility and long-term planning. She would mention concerns about complexity and the need for younger people to manage certain decisions. Perhaps she would even suggest that stepping aside would allow me to enjoy a simpler life without the burden of financial oversight. And Ethan, sitting beside her, would nod along because that was easier than challenging the direction she had already chosen. On Monday morning, I drove to Charles Benton's office one more time. He had already prepared several documents Daniel had arranged years earlier, including copies of the trust provisions and a brief legal summary explaining exactly what would happen if any beneficiary attempted to manipulate or discredit the primary trustee. Charles placed the documents neatly inside a slim leather folder and slid it across the desk toward me. He explained that nothing in those papers was aggressive or confrontational. They simply clarified the rules Daniel had established long ago, rules that protected the trust from exactly the kind of situation we were now facing. I thanked him and placed the folder beside my purse before leaving the office. The weather had turned warm that week, and when Wednesday finally arrived, the evening air carried the soft golden light of early summer. I chose a simple blue dress, the same one I had worn to church earlier that year. Nothing elaborate, nothing dramatic, just calm and ordinary. At 6:25, I arrived at the restaurant Vanessa had chosen. The hostess greeted me and guided me toward a quiet hallway at the back where a private dining room waited behind a polished wooden door. Through the glass panel, I could already see Ethan and Vanessa sitting at the table inside. Vanessa looked confident, relaxed, the way people look when they believe the evening ahead will unfold exactly as they planned. Ethan glanced toward the door as the hostess stepped aside and allowed me to enter the room. For a moment, none of us spoke. The table was set neatly with 3 glasses of water and a small candle flickering at the center. Vanessa smiled politely and gestured toward the empty chair across from them. I placed my purse beside the chair and sat down calmly. In her mind, this meeting was the beginning of the future she had designed for our family. What she did not yet realize was that Daniel Whitmore had designed something much earlier, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be understood. I sat across from Ethan and Vanessa and folded my hands lightly on the table while the small candle between us flickered. Vanessa began the conversation with a warm tone that sounded practiced. She spoke about family harmony and long-term stability, about how life becomes complicated when responsibilities grow larger than one person should manage alone. Ethan nodded beside her, occasionally glancing toward me as if hoping the evening would move smoothly without conflict. I listened quietly while she spoke. Her words were careful and polished, the kind people use when they want to sound supportive while guiding a conversation toward a very specific outcome. After a few minutes, she gently shifted the discussion toward what she called practical considerations for the future. She said that financial matters could become overwhelming and that sometimes the most responsible choice was to allow younger family members to step in and help organize complex decisions. Her eyes rested on me when she said this, and the meaning behind her words was perfectly clear. Ethan added that they both wanted what was best for everyone, and that simplifying certain responsibilities might allow me to enjoy life without unnecessary stress. I nodded once and reached for the water glass in front of me. The room remained calm, almost peaceful, as though the conversation were nothing more than a routine family discussion. Then I placed my glass down and opened my purse. Inside was the slim leather folder Charles Benton had given me earlier that week. I removed it slowly and set it on the table between us. Vanessa paused mid-sentence and watched my hands as I opened the folder. Ethan leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing the cautious optimism he had been carrying into the meeting. I slid the first document across the table so that both of them could see the heading clearly. It was a summary prepared by Charles explaining the structure of the Whitmore Family Trust Daniel had created years before. Vanessa's expression remained polite at first, but I noticed the faint tension forming around her eyes as she began reading. I spoke calmly while they looked at the page. I explained that Daniel had anticipated the possibility that someone might one day attempt to pressure the primary trustee to surrender responsibility. Because of that concern, he had written several provisions designed to protect the trust from influence or manipulation. Those provisions, I continued, did not rely on emotions or assumptions. They relied on documented actions. Ethan turned the page slowly while Vanessa read the second document. This one outlined what would happen if any beneficiary attempted to discredit or undermine the trustee through public humiliation, misinformation, or strategic pressure intended to force a transfer of authority. The language was precise and very clear. Under those circumstances, the trust automatically restricted that beneficiary's involvement in all supervisory decisions regarding the assets. Vanessa lifted her eyes from the document and looked directly at me for the first time since I entered the room. The calm confidence she carried earlier had faded slightly. Ethan glanced between the two of us, the meaning of the words settling gradually into his understanding. I did not raise my voice. I simply explained that Daniel believed respect within a family should never be treated as optional. If someone attempted to remove that respect in order to gain influence, then they also removed their own standing in matters connected to the trust. The candle on the table flickered again as a server quietly placed 3 plates of food near the edge of the table and left the room. None of us touched the dishes. Vanessa lowered her gaze to the documents again, reading each line more carefully now. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together once more. For a long moment the room was silent except for the faint sounds of dinner service in the hallway outside. Finally, Ethan exhaled slowly and looked at Vanessa with an expression I had not seen from him in a long time. It was not anger. It was realization. Vanessa had planned this meeting as the moment when control would shift toward her. Instead, she was discovering that Daniel Whitmore had already arranged the rules of that conversation years before she ever imagined holding it. For several seconds after Ethan looked up from the documents, no one at the table spoke. The quiet inside the private dining room felt different now, heavier but also clearer, like the moment after a storm when the sky has finally decided which direction the wind will move. Vanessa slowly placed the papers back on the table. Her expression was controlled, but the confidence she carried into the room had shifted into something more cautious. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and looked from the documents to me and then to Vanessa again. I could see the thoughts forming behind his eyes as the meaning of Daniel's planning settled fully into place. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice lower than before. He said he did not know that the trust contained provisions like the ones we had just read. I nodded calmly and explained that Daniel had never believed in leaving important things to chance. Years before his health declined, he had insisted on protecting the structure of the trust so that no one could reshape it through pressure or influence. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to respond, then paused. She glanced again at the pages in front of her, reading certain lines a second time. The room remained quiet except for the faint sounds of glasses and distant conversation drifting from the restaurant dining area outside. After a moment, she said carefully that her intention had never been to undermine anyone, that she had simply been thinking about efficiency and long-term planning. Her voice was smooth again, but the careful tone revealed that she was now choosing her words far more cautiously than before. I listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, I folded my hands gently on the table and answered in the same calm voice I had used all evening. I said that families often discuss planning, and that thoughtful conversations about the future were never a problem. What Daniel had wanted to prevent was something different. He had wanted to prevent the quiet rewriting of someone's dignity in order to gain control of decisions that were never meant to belong to them. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment and then looked directly at me again. There was regret in his expression now, the kind that appears when someone realizes that silence in the wrong moment can become its own kind of decision. He said that the dinner the week before should never have unfolded the way it did. I did not argue with him. Instead, I simply acknowledged that moments like that reveal more than people often expect. Vanessa remained still for a few seconds, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the documents. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked less like someone guiding a conversation and more like someone reconsidering a strategy that no longer worked. Eventually, the server returned quietly to ask whether we wished to continue with dinner. Ethan nodded automatically, though none of us had touched the plates already sitting on the table. When the server left again, the candle flame in the center of the table flickered gently. I closed the leather folder and slid it back into my purse. The documents had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had not accused anyone. They had not raised voices or created a scene. They had simply reminded everyone in the room that Daniel Whitmore had already decided how respect within this family would be protected. I stood slowly from the table and adjusted the strap of my purse. Ethan rose as well, looking uncertain about what to say next. Vanessa remained seated, watching quietly as the evening she had carefully arranged reached a conclusion she had not expected. I thanked them both for agreeing to meet and said that clarity was always valuable in a family. Then I walked toward the door of the private dining room. As I stepped into the softly lit hallway of the restaurant, I felt the same calm certainty I had felt when I left the building earlier that afternoon after speaking with Charles Benton. Vanessa had believed she could reshape my place in this family by choosing the right moment and the right audience. What she had discovered instead was something Daniel had understood long before any of this began. Respect is not something that can be quietly removed from a person who knows exactly where they stand.